All right. Thank you, everybody. We are on to our third presentation entitled Insects in Your Garden, More Than Just Monarchs, presented by Jennifer Hopwood with the Xerces Society. Jennifer is a senior pollinator conservation specialist at the Xerces Society and is based in Omaha. She provides resources and guidance about pollinator and beneficial insect conservation to conservation professionals, agency staff, and anyone who is interested. She has worked at Xerces for nearly 15 years. Right, welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. How is the sound? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate that introduction. Just really briefly, are there folks out there who have heard of Xerces before? Okay, that's wonderful. It's lovely to see so many hands. So we're a conservation nonprofit, and we're historically based in Portland, Oregon. We started out about 52 years ago as an organization that was working to conserve butterflies specifically, and then expanded our mission to all invertebrates. And we approach conservation from a number of different angles. We're involved in on-the-ground restoration and research and supporting community science and also policy and advocacy. And as we already mentioned, I'm based here in Omaha, and I have two other colleagues who are based in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we have a really nice support base here in the Great Plains. And Xerces works to protect invertebrates because they make up a huge amount of biodiversity on the planet. Invertebrates are 97% of all animals on the planet, and insects are about 50%. So they're hugely diverse, and they make up a huge amount of biomass. There's something like 2 billion insects out there for every person on the planet. So they're just numerous as well. And of all the million species plus of insects, it's really just a small fraction that people think of as pests that cause harm to people or to indirect harm or even nuisance. The vast majority of insects out there are playing really, really critical roles that benefit us directly or benefit food webs and ecosystems that we also indirectly depend upon. So just really quickly, I'm going to spend some time talking about the roles of insects in our lives. And I know this first role you're all very familiar with because you're here today as part of this event, but pollinators and pollination is a really important ecosystem role. More than 85% of flowering plants on the planet depend on an animal to move pollen between flowers because plants cannot get up and find a mate. They need to have an insect transfer it between their blooms. And the fruits and seeds that are the product of pollination are a really important part of the life cycle of many other wildlife as well. So pollinators are really critical for wild plant pollination and those natural communities. And then, of course, they're really important to our diet too. They're responsible for many fruits and vegetables, for seed oils. They fit into our diets in many other unique ways. If you enjoy potato chips, for example, although potatoes are not the direct result of animal pollination, they are fried in sunflower oil or canola oil, which are the direct result of animal pollination. So our food systems are just really intricately linked to these animals. And really in more ways than one, too, because there are a broad range of predatory insects and parasitoid insects out there that provide pest control of arthropods and insects that are feeding on our food crops or other crops that we are growing. And these predators and parasitoids are providing natural control by feeding on these crop pests. And that's a service worth up to $12 billion annually every year in the US. So they're providing us with a lot of benefits economically. But beyond that, they're also keeping natural populations in check, other insects in check. And insects and other invertebrates also play a really critical role in soil health. And soil, of course, is foundational for life on our planet. These insects help to decompose plant and animal waste. They integrate nutrients in the soil layer, taking the nutrients from the top of the surface of the soil and moving it down below where plants can access it and need it more. They also help make channels that help water and air get down to deeper layers of the soil. That's also really critical for plants. All of their work in tunneling moves soil around, so it changes the soil structure, making it healthier and helping bacteria and fungi to do the work that they need to do that's really critical in soil health. So they're essential for plant productivity. It's just really, really important. So all the things we grow for food, for shelter, and for fuel is all linked back to this soil life. And then there are many insects that are herbivores. They strictly eat plants. And that's a really beneficial role because they help to keep certain plant populations in check. And they're also food for wildlife. So wildlife that aren't going to eat plants get their energy by eating these herbivores. And there's a lot of birds out there that depend on insects as part of their life cycle. Like 90% of all birds feed their young invertebrates, particularly caterpillars, grasshoppers, beetles, things like that. So it's really critical for their life cycle to have these herbivorous insects out there in the world. Some of these herbivores are very host specific. They have a very tight plant relationship. And of course, you're probably thinking of monarchs right away. Monarch butterflies depend on milkweed species. So it can be very host specific, or it can be very, very broad, in which case you might have a beetle or another butterfly larva that can feed on plants from multiple different families. But in any case, these herbivores play a really critical role in the food web systems. And then insects also just inspire wonder and delight and amazement. They inspire us to develop new technologies. They just provide us with endless fascination. And they also just have intrinsic value, their own unique deservance to live on our planet alongside us. So I'm going to spend the next little bit talking about some of the insect groups that you can find in your space, with a special focus on insects that you can see out there in the landscape right now in the fall. I'm going to start with the herbivores. These are leaf beetles. There are beetles that feed on all various parts of the plants. And this is a really diverse group of beetles. They can look like a bunch of different things. And at the top of this screen, you see this beetle that looks a little bit like a tortoise. In its color, it's really brightly metallic. And then on the bottom, you see this bright green beetle. And there are variations all in between. But if you've ever seen a cucumber beetle in your garden, that's a leaf beetle as well. And the adults feed on different parts of the plant above ground, like leaves and flowers and seeds. And the larvae can feed above ground as well as below ground on roots. So they are herbivores both as larvae, which aren't pictured here, and as adults. And they can be very generalists or they can be very specialists. Some other herbivore groups include the cicadas. And we are past cicada season now. But these are the animals that make this wonderful calling sound in the middle of the summer. And the larvae feed underground. So the adults will lay eggs on trees, and then the larvae drop off and dig down to find plant roots. And then we'll feed there for a year or two or more in some cases, and then emerge and transform into the adult that we all know and love, and makes that really loud cacophony midsummer. And cicadas are important for soil health as well as herbivores, because they do channel underneath the soil and create more space for plant roots to move and change soil structure. One really unique thing about cicadas is that the periodical cicadas have longer life cycles. In fact, they have one of the longest life cycles of insects out there. They can live up between 13 and 17 years. And these groups of cicadas will time their emergence with other species of cicadas so that they emerge in mass every 13 or 17 years. And this is an advantage to them because they come out in huge numbers and they swarm the field. And so they obviously have a lot of predators that feed on them heavily, but they're always individuals that survive to reproduce. But what's really incredible about these cicadas is that they can count. It's very rare that they emerge at 8 years or 10 years. They have a way to figure out when it's 13 and when it's 17. Next up on the herbivores are caterpillars. So Lepidoptera, like butterflies and moths. Those caterpillars are feeding on plants in various ways. And I'm choosing to focus on hawk moths here. And hawk moths are also pollinators. Caterpillars of hawk moths, also known as hummingbird moths or sphinx moths, feed on a variety of plants, sometimes more closely related groups, but also they can be found on plants in the Rosaceae family or Solanaceae. And the adults are beautiful and quite large. And what's really unique about them is that they can beat their wings at quite high speeds, and they can hover in front of flowers in a very similar way that hummingbirds do. And they have an extremely long tongue, like you can see in the top picture there, that they'll extend into the flower to sip nectar. So I believe it's a hawk moth that has the longest tongue on the planet. And some fly during the day, but many fly in the evening, crepuscular hour, or at night. And many hawk moths have tight relationships with flowers. There are some plants that are only pollinated by hawk moths. So here in Nebraska, for example, there are a couple evening primroses that are pollinated by hawk moths, and the Western Prairie Fringed Orchid. And another group of pollinators are sunflower bees. This is a group of solitary bees, which means that each individual female builds her own nest and provides for her young. She doesn't cooperate with other members of her species or of her relatives. And these bees build their nest in the ground. So they'll look for a small patch of bare ground, maybe next to other nests of the same species or of other bees. And she'll dig maybe a foot to 2 feet to create tunnels, and then she'll have cells. And bees are particularly efficient pollinators because they actively collect pollen off of flowers. So they visit flowers and they start to comb pollen off the flower and get it on their bodies and then carry it back to their nests. And you can see in these two pictures that they both have lots and lots of yellow or orange pollen on their hind legs that they carry back to the nest. And that pollen becomes food for their larvae, and they feed their young pollen and nectar to grow. It's a really important source of protein and carbohydrates. So these particular groups of bees that I am calling sunflower bees are bees that are out and about in the fall and that only collect pollen from plants in the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. So you can find them on goldenrod or sunflowers or silphiums, or here on asters. And so they time their emergence every year with these host flowers, these host plants. So they're only fly in the fall. And other groups of bees nest above ground. For example, the leafcutter bees. And these bees are also solitary. So it's each individual bee that's collecting materials to build her nests. Leafcutter bees, as you might have guessed, cut leaves, and the females will crimp a piece of the leaf, she'll cut it out, she'll carry it back to her nest, and then she'll layer the leaves and crimp them together so they form like a very waterproof tight little packet. And then inside that packet, as you can see right here, is the bundle of pollen and nectar, and right on top is the little baby egg. And so they nest within stems or other tunnels, rock cavities, sometimes in man-made structures like screw holes on tables, all over the place, and in the upper layer of the soil as well. And then another group of bees are bumblebees. And bumblebees, as opposed to the solitary bees that work individually, bumblebees actually form small social colonies. So each colony is founded by a queen bee who is the only individual within her colony that lays eggs. And so she lays a bunch of eggs, she rears them out into her first generation of daughters, and those bees help her grow the colony over the summer to bring in more resources and to protect the colony if need be, and just to keep it, to keep everything running. And so the colony builds and builds in size until right about now, this time of year, new queens are being reared, new males are reared, they leave the colony to find new mates, and the rest of the colony dies off. So it's just the queens that overwinter in the fall. And bumblebees nest both above ground and below ground. Really what they're looking for is an insulated cavity. So that can be something that's really very messy, like an old bird's nest or an old rodent burrow. It can be man-made. In my house in Omaha, I have a garage that was made on cinder blocks. So the cinder blocks are still there, and I've found bumblebees beginning nests in the cinder blocks within the garage. They're just looking for something to help keep them warm early in the spring when they're trying to grow their colony. And bumblebees are really hugely important pollinators, not just for agricultural crops, but for wild plants as well. Next up are solitary wasps, which are also pollinators. And the adult females of solitary wasps are visiting flowers to sip nectar, which provides them with lots of energy. And they need that energy because their main role is to hunt insects in the landscape and bring those back to their nest to provide for their young. So whereas bees provide pollen and nectar, predatory wasps are providing insects and arthropods. So this could be caterpillars, it could be spiders, grasshoppers, crickets. Each group of wasps really has their preferred sources, or many groups of wasps have their preferred source. So this is a mason wasp, and they tend to really like caterpillars. This is a scoliid wasp, and the females will dig down into turf and find Japanese beetle larvae or other beetle grubs in turf grass, and will lay their eggs on those grubs, and then their young eat them alive. So they nest in the same places as many bees do, in the ground or above ground in tunnels. And they play a really important role in biological control, contributing to pest control as well as being pollinators. And that's a similar story for this group of flies as well. These are hover flies or syrphid flies or flower flies. The adults are really common on flowers because they drink nectar and sometimes eat pollen. But their larvae are predatory, and they're very small, sometimes legless, and they're voracious. So this tiny little fly larvae right there is taking down an aphid, which is not particularly large, but it's still quite a bit larger than the fly larva. But they are very good at hunting small insects. And this is a group that really relies on that leaf layer or the upper soil layer. That's where they overwinter. And that's going to be a trend that you see in a lot of the different insects we're talking about today, how important that upper soil layer is and that leaf layer. Another group that you'll see right now in your garden, particularly on goldenrod, is this group of soldier beetles. This is a species that's really common right now. And they are also predatory as larvae, and they hunt different groups of small insects or eat insect eggs, as is pictured here. And the adults are on flowers, drinking nectar and eating pollen. And another group important in biological control are lady beetles. This is a group that's very familiar to people and has actually been recognized throughout human history as being really important to lady beetles, or to pest control, because that's the theory of how it got its nickname, lady beetles. Back in the medieval times, it was thought that farmers said, this is Our Lady, the beetle of Our Lady, because they noticed a difference in their crop production when they had lady beetles present versus when they didn't. And they are really valuable predators. You can see this is what the larva looks like. It looks like an armored tiny mini alligator, and they're out there hunting aphids, mealybugs, mites, those types of critters. And lady beetles overwinter as adults. So you'll see adult lady beetles flying around right now. They're looking for shelter under bark or in the leaf layer. So again, that insulation that leaf layers provide is really important for them. Next up are lacewings. And these too overwinter as adults. So right now in your garden, you can find them on flowers as adults, drinking nectar and just storing up food for the winter. And they will overwinter under bark or in not to be a broken record, but in the leaf layer or in the upper layer of the soil. And then they'll emerge in the spring as adults and lay their eggs. And their larvae are nicknamed aphid lions because they too are really good hunters. To switch gears a little bit, this is a group that's really important in biological control. These are parasitoid wasps. They're often very, very small wasps, and they lay their eggs in or inside their hosts, so on or inside their hosts. And in this picture here, you can see this is a female wasp injecting her egg into that aphid. Their eggs hatch into larvae, and then they often have clever strategies to keep their host alive while their larvae feed on them and develop. And when their larvae reach the time to pupate, that's when the host dies. So they might paralyze the host in a secure location to be able to feed off of it, or they can sometimes trigger behaviors to keep their host defensive against predators, or basically they can suspend them so that they can slowly be eaten alive over time. And the groups of wasps in this that have this behavior are often very host specific. So there's this saying out there that for every insect on the planet, there's a parasitoid wasp. And sometimes for parasitoid wasps, there are parasitoid wasps. There's just so many species, and it's probably, hundreds of thousands of species that we still haven't identified and recognized yet. But because they have that really tight host parasitoid relationship, they do have a really critical role in biological control. And I imagine that if you grow milkweeds, or if you have something like Rudbeckia or Rutibita in your garden, you've probably had aphids at some point, have a big colony of aphids on your plants. Usually it doesn't take long for the parasitoid wasps to sneak in and lay their eggs, and the result is that you end up in a couple weeks with these aphid mummies. These are just empty shells of the aphid that was, and the parasitoid wasps have already exited. So it's sometimes very hard to see them in your space because they are so tiny. But looking for things like aphid mummies can help you recognize that they are out there, and they definitely are. All right, a couple more groups to touch on really quickly. Ground beetles are important in biological control as well as in soil health. This is another group of predators, and they're predators, both larvae and adults. So they're out there hunting, and ground beetles hunt things like slugs and snails and really quite large pests. So they can be very important in cropping systems, so much so that some growers will plant bunch grasses within the crop field to help provide shelter in the wintertime. So the beetles will move in to that shelter in the wintertime and will spend the winter within those bunch grasses, and then will move back out into the crop when they need food sources in the spring. Another group important in soil health and biological control are fireflies. And these are beetles that have really leathery wing covers, but probably most importantly, you recognize them because they have these really amazing flashing displays to attract mates in the summer. And we have a number of species that you can see do those flashing displays here in Omaha. And this is what the larvae look like. And this was taken in my yard here in Omaha, and they too glow in the last segment of their body, and they are active in the leaf layer and in the upper soil layer, and they are hunters, and they are impressive hunters. They will chase down earthworms and search earthworm burrows and tackle them, even though earthworms are significantly larger than them, and they will also eat slugs and snails. So they play a really important soil health predator role. All right, so that gives you a quick overview of some of the groups that are really important in your space. And as you probably know, with regards to, in particular, monarch butterflies and perhaps with other pollinators, there are some groups that have undergone declines in recent years. And these declines are happening not just within some groups of pollinators like bumblebees and some groups of butterflies, but around the world to many other insect groups as well. So there's fewer numbers of insects out there, and there's declines in species richness. So at certain sites you find fewer insect species and you certainly find lower quantities. And this is really something that scientists are pretty concerned about because of all the various roles that insects play in ecosystems. And I didn't even touch on some of them, but they're also involved in water quality and other really critical roles. And these insect declines are driven by habitat loss, overuse of pesticides, disease spread, climate change exacerbating the effects of habitat loss and so forth. So there's a lot of factors that are contributing to these declines. And what we know is that we really need to support them as much as possible with habitat. So that means protecting whatever natural habitat is already on the landscape as much as possible, and then also creating additional habitat wherever we can. So that can be, it can be on farms where habitat can be really compatible in supporting pest control or providing other functional roles on farms to protect soil or protect water. It can be on roadsides where there are similar goals of reducing erosion. It can be within utility rights of way. It can be within parks, where we live, everywhere we live, work and play, essentially. And, you know, what we do in our own space can be really important as well, because insects don't require acres and acres and acres. Boy, that's the second time I've done that. Sorry, I obviously talk with my hands. But they don't require acres and acres of habitat. Many species don't. And so when we create habitat on a small scale in our yard or wherever we live, it can have an impact in supporting pollinators, supporting soil health, and so on. And really the foundation of that is native plants, and plants can make it all possible. And we've got a table outside if you're looking for native plant lists. It's a good place to start if you want information about species that have really high value for pollinators and beneficial insects as well. And just a couple of the key things to think about, and I know the other presentations have touched on this too, but just to bring it full circle, that our landscapes are providing a lot of different services in addition to providing pollen and nectar from wildflowers or trees or shrubs. They're also providing places where insects overwinter or nest. And so thinking about how you might be able to leave some stems can be really important for those tunnel nesting species. Leaving tiny patches of bare ground within your garden, planting grasses, especially bunch grasses, if you can, leaving stumps or hiding logs like I do in our yard, or having piles of rocks. And then of course, leaving the leaves, which I know you've heard before in the previous two presentations, that can be a really important shelter and insulation in the wintertime. So if you want to move them off of your turf grass and pile them on your flower beds or vegetable beds or under trees or shrubs, that could be that insulating layer where all sorts of things overwinter. It's also been mentioned, of course, but pesticides can have unintended consequences. So before you reach for the chemical, think about if there are alternatives you can use to manage the pest, or perhaps you don't need to take any action to manage what you think might be a pest issue. Sometimes what you see as damage is actually just a plant doing its job, which is supporting life. And that's really what we want to see. We want to see caterpillars chewing on plants. And you do want to see milkweeds covered in aphid mummies. Those are signs that there's a lot of interesting dynamics happening in your yard. And of course, I'm echoing the message of the previous presenter as well, but signs can really help showcase what you're doing. It can bring up questions with neighbors or within your community. So that can be a helpful way to start conversations with people. And then there are so many opportunities in Omaha to get involved with sharing plants, with growing plants, supporting pollinator habitat and other habitat. We do have resources available. We have a bunch of books available. We also have publications you can download, or if you want to visit April at the table, she's got copies of many things to provide guidance. And I want to wind up by saying that Xerces is a donor based organization. And so donors really support our work and we're really thankful for their support. And then I want to leave you with my final thoughts, which is that the things that you're doing in your space is really important to your space. You're making changes that support wildlife in your own space. And that has benefits to your own space and to you and to the next generation, but it also is really a part of a larger effort to support insects on the landscape and to mitigate these insect declines. So thank you very much.